Hey, kinder and first grade teachers. This is Shannon Haney, teaching and learning TOSA for our district. You're at your Savvas training. It's November. Welcome. Before we start our training with our fabulous Savvas trainers, we want to take a moment to just sort of contextualize some resources and some ideas we have for science this year. So without further ado, I'm going to move myself off screen a little bit so you don't have to look at my face the whole time. All right, so here we go. So we can't get through anything, I think, these days without talking about Scarborough's reading rope. I want you to think of today, science, as sort of addressing the top part of Scarborough's rope. So specifically background knowledge, building content knowledge, and vocabulary, okay? So before we start, let's kind of begin with the end in mind. So this right here is a paragraph, obviously. And my question for you is, what must students know to understand this paragraph? Now, a little bit of background for you is that this is one paragraph of several from a passage from a Smarter Balanced performance task. It's a released test question, right? And this is for fourth grade. So a fourth grader would read a passage similar to this, many paragraphs similar to this, and have to then write and answer some questions around this particular concept. So I'll give you a moment, right? And the question being, what background knowledge, skills, etc., would kids have to have intact so that this is actually not a majorly cognitively demanding task just getting through reading this passage? And here's what that might look like, right? I mean, my goodness, right? There's a lot that goes into knowing what that passage is saying. All right, so you might look at this and say, well, gosh, I'm a kinder first grade teacher. My students know where the North Pole is. I don't know if they know that there's a South Pole, right? You might say negative numbers. Gosh, can we just talk about regular numbers, plain old numbers, right? So from a primary perspective, I might say like, gosh, there's a whole bunch of skills that kids have to know even before they know those prerequisite skills to read this paragraph, right? And that's understandable, of course. So we also want to point out that Googling is not a reading strategy. It seems like more and more people are like, oh, you can just Google it. We can just Google it. We don't know something we read. We just Google it. But Googling is not necessarily a very effective or efficient reading strategy. Thinking about that paragraph, if I had to Google everything that I might stumble on, there'd be a lot of questions I'd have to ask Google, right? And of course, no adult is going to do that. And it's just not a very effective or efficient way to read one paragraph, to have to Google every single thing. So students and adults alike would not do that, and they'd probably make some funny inferences that weren't exactly accurate, right? Or certainly not close to what the author intended, right? So Googling is not a reading strategy. We must have background knowledge. We must have access to knowledge in order to read informational text, or any text, really. It's just all the more helpful, especially as text gets increasingly complex across the grades. The more background knowledge we have already, the more we can add to that bank of knowledge. So again, today is all about the top part of the rope. And elementary science kind of looks like this. We have our science classroom with this classroom teacher. That's us, right? Us in the first grade. And then we've got our engineering lab, which is where our science specialist works. Our program that we're using is the Savvas Elevate Science program, and they are using a curriculum called Project Lead the Way. Both of these programs are next generation science standard aligned. Our work involves text and hands-on investigations. Their work involves hands-on engineering projects. We have a science knowledge building focus. We're building science knowledge for our kids. They have a science and STEM focus. Okay, so we're going to talk about what happens in the science classroom and some ideas for what we can focus on to help our students build that top part of the rope. So first thing to note, I find this page incredibly helpful, at least looking at it one time. If you want to tab it and because you think you might need it later, great. It's page T8 in your paper TE, your manual, if you brought that with you. So an important understanding for us as teachers of NGSS is to understand that NGSS is phenomena-based. So, if you've taught science for a little bit, we used to use the scientific method. We'd start with a question, a hypothesis, a procedure, conclusion, etc. All of that is still intact here, but scientists actually study real-world events, or they look at something, they notice it first, and then they start to investigate it. So it's really more about observing something that's happening. It could be solving a problem, like how do we cure cancer versus, how many Mentos does it take to explode a 2-liter bottle of Coke? I don't know. They're both phenomena that we might observe and wonder and dig and ask and then investigate even further. So we're thinking about phenomenon, a phenomenon or phenomena, the plural, right? Which in kinder and first, I feel like a lot of them, like everything's kind of a phenomenon to them. So this might be a really easy model for them, for our little guys to take on, right? But it's really about that observation and then investigation. So what are we observing? We still have our handy dandy, our old friends, physical science, life science, earth and space science, and we have engineering standards that are embedded throughout those 3 strands. So there's really 3 sets of standards, but engineering is kind of lives throughout, okay? So there you go. And this is what our framework looks like. So, this is not our framework. This is a breakdown of what our framework looks like, an overview, if you will. In our framework, so our standards are supported with frameworks like our other content areas. In our framework, each of us, each grade level has what are called instructional segments, and that term is going to become important because that's the term that's used in our curriculum, Savvas, right? So in kindergarten, for example, you can see you have 1, 2, 3, 4. You have 4 instructional segments. First grade also has 4. I think most of the grade levels have 4. I think 4th grade is the only one that has 5. Yep. But you can see they're color-coded according to life science, earth science, and physical science, okay? So something just to note, and why this is kind of cool to look at, I think at least, is that notice even the vocabulary gets more sophisticated as you go across the grade level. So looking at kinder and first, right? I see plants and animals, great. Pushes, pulls, shadows, light, plant shapes and sounds, animal sounds, right? I see a lot of really accessible words. And then if you look at 2nd grade, there's kind of this like a little bit of a jump, right? We have biodiversity in landscapes, right? In fact, the word landscape shows up in all 4 titles of their instructional segments. I don't think I knew what landscape was when I was in 2nd grade, but it seems like after 2nd grade, a lot of our 2nd graders are going to know a lot about land, what it looks like, who lives on it, what it's made out of, how it changes, right? Also, the word biodiversity, that's 7 syllables, right? I think, right? You'll count it later. So there's this big jump, right? We're now that biodiversity in landscapes is a very jargony or tier 3-ish sort of phrase, right? That's a very science-y phrase. So just noting that, like that's where kids are going, right? Okay. So building science knowledge over time, we have our earth, life, physical science with engineering embedded throughout. And from K through 6, it kind of looks like this, right? That makes sense. So what we want to stress is that it's important to get to all 3 dimensions of science, or all 3 disciplinary core ideas in science this year, even if it's not perfect, right? So if a 3rd grade teacher, for example, is like, oh, gosh, I got through life, I did physical, but I just didn't get a chance to, hit earth science at all this year. It just got away from me, which happens, of course. But the only problem is that there might be a potential hole in the students' background knowledge if they go from 2nd to 4th grade without ever having any kind of discussion around earth science. These standards, like our other standards, are built to build from one year to the next, right? So we really want students to build this knowledge over time, and the standards are laid out and the curriculum is laid out so that they can build off of the previous year. So even if it's not perfect, even if you're like, well, all we did was open the book, read a couple pages, answer some questions, talk about whatever, but it wasn't this big, beautiful, perfect thing that you wanted it to be, that's okay. You'll get it next year. This is our first year. It never has to be perfect. No one's perfect, right? But at least try to get to all 3 disciplinary core ideas, because we don't want to create on purpose or on accident or because it got away from us. I just never had them look at that text at all, whatever. We really want students to at least have a chance, have that access, so that next year they have a little something, closer in their memory to hang that, a little more schema to hang that new knowledge on, okay? So that's what we are investigating. How are we investigating? Let's go back to our science and engineering practices. So these are just, how scientists study things, how we're going to study these phenomena. And for us in the primary grades, it might be more just, modeling these things, doing a lot of think alouds. You can look at these later, but when we lay them down next to our standards for mathematical practice, there's a lot of common language, a lot of common ideas. And it makes sense that we would study science and math, there'd be some, overlap, obviously. So words like persevere, the use of models, constructing arguments, among others. We could sit here for an hour and talk about everything they have in common, right? So just good to know. The other thing is this idea of cross-cutting concepts. So I'll give you a moment to look over those. You see things like patterns and cause and effect and systems, energy flow. Flow, where have I heard that before? Structure, change. All these words should kind of hopefully conjure up some different ideas in other parts of our curriculum that you might be familiar with. So I think about math. We look at patterns in math all the time. ELA, thinking maps, depth and complexity if you're trained in the GATE model. So again, whenever these things cross over and it looks like things we've talked about in other subject areas or other programs, we can kind of breathe a sigh of relief. Oh, this isn't something new. This is something we've talked about before. There's another way to look at it, right? So the good news is you don't have to plan all of these things. It's not like we're adding in, like, how are you going to talk about patterns in this, right? But when you see it in the curriculum does all of it for you. Savvas has done a great job laying all these things out. When you see patterns come up, and that, that's why that's there. It's because it's a cross-cutting concept, and it's just a reminder like, oh, is there another place I can mention patterns, or I can have the students talk about patterns, right? Again, all this has been planned out for you, but just want to make that kind of illuminate that for you a little bit, okay? So the next thing is like, okay, the program's done all that, so what's my job? And your job is mainly just this idea of immersing students in it, right? So how do we immerse students? One of the ways is to ask just really great questions and listen for those answers. So page T11 has some great questions. What questions can you ask about? How could you measure this? What might have caused that? Have you seen this before? How is this like that? These are just good questions to ask students in the middle of a lesson as they're doing a lab, as you're doing a lab and you're showing them what could happen. Just other things to think about. Sometimes it's hard to come up with those good questions in the moment, like what's the next thing I should say right here to get them to think about whatever you're trying to get them to think about. These are great for thinking maps too. So just a great page full of great questions to get that critical thinking going. All right, so that all sounds great. Got it, curriculum, what we're kind of focusing on, but how, when, what does this look like in practice? You will let us know, by the way, what it looks like in practice. And let me say before we talk about this part, it's November. So if you've already started science and you've already, I know the materials were delivered last year, people were kind of told like, hey, dabble if you want, but no pressure. You're getting trained this year, and here it is November. You're all getting officially trained by Savvas today. So if you've already started the year and you've already got something that works for you, then today is just informational, right? Another way to do it. If you haven't started yet, or you've been waiting for this training, then maybe this part is more relevant to you. But either way, you're going to make it work for what you can do in your classroom with your schedule with your students, okay? So here's kind of an idea. If Monday through Friday, minimum day is Wednesday, and maybe your lab/music day is Friday, could you possibly get a little bit of science in the other 3 days? And I know that sounds like a lot, but remember, science for primary grades, it might be like 15 minutes on Monday where you introduce the phenomenon, you talk about it, you make a little thinking map, show them a little picture, talk about what they see, whatever. Then Tuesday, we go into the text a little bit. You're reading aloud to them. Maybe they're doing some work with the text. They're circling things, whatever, writing a couple words, depending upon where we're at grade level. And maybe Thursday you do a lab, and maybe you're doing the lab. Maybe they're doing part of the lab, whatever you decide. But it really doesn't have to be an hour a day, right? This is not an hour-long lesson. You can make it 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. What we like to say is if you taught 0 science last year because you were like, thank goodness for the science specialists, they were taking care of it. And we do know that Wonders has been covering some of our science and history standards, so there is that, right? But if you're like, you didn't teach any of it from a curriculum or whatever, and this year maybe you get 1 lesson in. If you taught 2 lessons, maybe you get 3 lessons. Just you got to work with what you have, okay? So ease yourself into it, give yourself grace, especially because this is new, right? Year 1, that's when we learn all the things that we want to do for year 2. So this is kind of a lab on Friday model. If you have music and lab on Monday, Wednesday's minimum day, could you do it the other couple days? This would be a lab on Monday model. A lab on Tuesday model might look like this. A lab on Thursday model might look like this. A lab on Wednesday model, where you have both a minimum day and lab, which is, again, taking little chunks out of our literary block. I get that, literacy block, I get it. So you maybe not do any of that on Friday, do no science on Friday just to make up for that lost time or whatever, that not necessarily lost time, but the minimum day does cut into it, right? So whatever we couldn't get to Wednesday, we might have to do that Friday. So lab on Wednesday model looks a little different. Again, just a suggestion, just an idea. If you can only get it in 2 days a week, then that's what you can do, okay? We always say more science is better than no science, okay? So if we take the days of the week without Wednesday, without that minimum day, and we sort of look at like the actual instructional minutes we have between the bells. Here's an example of a kindergarten day that has 316 minutes of instructional time, right? So if I teach a 30-minute science lesson, which would be, that's pretty good size for kinder and first, that's a good size lesson. That would be almost 9%, about 9% of the instructional minutes. So what could I do with 9% of 316 minutes, right? It's not that much when you think about it like that. Now, keep in mind, we have to acknowledge that, yes, these are the instructional minutes, but none of these minutes account for transitioning between activities and events and the fact that it takes 5 minutes to walk a whole line of kindergartners across the blacktop or 10 minutes or whatever, right? So all of that has to be obviously calculated in, but 9% of the school day, 1 or 2 days, 2 or 3 days a week. Could it be done? That's the question. Is it possible? So you could even try that. You could make a little brace map. How many instruction minutes do you actually have? Would it be possible? We do have some sample schedules for you at the link here, and they're also, I'll show you another resource where you can find this as well, but we have one for kinder, one for first, one for second, and then one for 3rd through 6th grade. This is a kinder example. Again, this is just a sample. It's not a model. This isn't what it should exactly look like. This says draft on it because it will always say draft probably, right? They'll never have like the perfect model, and it'll never look just like everybody's schedule in the district, right? Not everybody starts at 7:55 in the morning. Not everybody has the same recess, lunch, etc. So an example of what it could look like with your Haggerty, with your Wonders, with all the other stuff in there could be this, right? Again, you got to make it work for you. But one thing we like to say, though, is just at least try to put it down in the schedule. And even if it doesn't always happen exactly perfect because of this, that, and the other, you at least have to, this is a good conversation starter, right? It's like building architectural plans for a house. If you don't at least draw the picture of the kitchen, you might be in danger of not even putting a kitchen in the house, right? So you want to at least put all the parts and pieces there, and then talk about like, is this actually happening, or is this just like a dream, right? It's just good conversation when we talk about schedules and time. All right, so here's what the pacing looks like, or what their pacing guide looks like. An example, obviously this is kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade. They're not all identical like this, but this is the basic idea. Each one starts with the instructional segment. Remember we said those words, that instructional segment was that phrase from the framework. You see that's here's segment 1, segment 2, segment 3, segment 4, and I'm pointing to that black lettering in the blue under there where it says California Spotlight. You notice the California bear there. So each instructional segment starts with a launch of something related to California, like let's study the California condor, right? And then at the end of the instructional segment, you revisit that concept. Well, how's the California condor, right? That's just an example. But each of these instructional segments, from what we've been told, you can move these instructional segments in any order. So if you want to teach IS2 and then IS3 and then IS1 and then IS4, fine, right? What we can't do, though, is move the topics around. So underneath each instructional segment, we have topics. So think of them as like chapters, right? So I wouldn't want to do, oh, I'm going to do IS3, but I'm going to do 4 and then I'm going to do 3, right? We wouldn't want to tangle with those and teach the topics out of order. All right. So what we did in Wonders, obviously we noticed in Wonders that Wonders is touching on some scientific concepts. Now Wonders is laid out in a specific order, mostly because the Lexile levels of the Lit Anthology story, which kicks in the middle of first grade, also called the Literature Big Book in K, those books get more complex across the year. So if you notice in the beginning of kindergarten, like there's not a lot of numbers in those Lexile levels, and then slowly you start getting some numbers as you go up and you look at the pacing in Wonders, right? So that's because the text is obviously growing more complex across the year. So we don't really want to tangle with that too much and start putting like the most complex text in front of kids at the beginning of the year, right? So Wonders has stayed intact. But what we did say is, gosh, if we could be smart about it and kind of lay down these instructional segments in a strategic way, where if there's any common conversation, could teachers kind of build out a little mini unit that is a little more saturated, right? So for example, here we're studying plants. I think week 2 in Wonders, I'm going to point right here. How do plants change as they grow? The word root is a vocabulary word. And here we're studying plant parts in Savvas. So you can see up here, I'm sorry I didn't introduce this, but Wonders is the first column, Savvas is the second column, right? So the word root and the word root, like 2 vocabulary words that come up in our curricula, 2 separate curricula, but kind of, defining the same thing here, okay? Now we did lay out over here, we mentioned that the STEM lab, the engineering lab, is going to be using Project Lead the Way. Their curriculum, Project Lead the Way, also has to be taught in a very specific order because it builds over time. So noting that when it did match, when it did kind of fit, we just kind of wanted to elevate that. So here we, in Savvas, we're going to be talking about the word mimic. But just a couple weeks ago, we talked about biomimicry, and you see the word mimic there as well, right? So for you as a classroom teacher to know, oh gosh, possibly a couple weeks ago, they might have already heard this concept, is good information, because then you kind of know they might have some background knowledge, they might have heard this word before. I should be able to build off that, right? Maybe save a little bit of time, okay? The other thing to note on here is that next to these vocabulary words, we've got these little icons. So you see a speech bubble and a hand that's writing. So this is just our little reminder that when students are speaking and writing using these vocabulary words, it's probably good formative data for you as the teacher to know that they might have this concept, right? We like to say vocabulary is a proxy for knowledge. So think about it, whenever you hear any expert talk about their field and they use a lot of jargon, right? They use a lot of tier 3 vocabulary and it's all meaningful and it makes sense. Then you're like, oh, this person is an expert, right? So that's just something to think about. The same thing goes with your students when they're starting to use these words that you've been talking about in a thoughtful way that you know is correct and everything else. Then you're like, oh, I think they have it, right? This is in the moment data we get from kids that they have learned something, right? So we pulled out all the vocab from Wonders and put it here. We also added an ear, a little ear over here, so that they, some of these words are going to be kind of beyond them a little bit, or maybe they aren't necessarily words that they're writing yet, but they should be words that they're hearing. It's because we certainly know that the top part of the rope probably develops, for some of them, most of them, faster than their concepts of the bottom part of the rope. So they can understand things that are read aloud much quicker than they will be able to learn to actually decode those words. But there's no reason they shouldn't hear, about transportation, even though they're not exactly equipped to write the entire word out just yet. For example, okay? So just something to think about. We did that work. This is for this year. You guys might give us feedback and be like, look, this doesn't make any sense. Just because the words match doesn't mean the concepts go. Like, can we move this one here? You'll give us feedback, or you might try it a different way this year. This is year one. So we try things and then we can revise them as needed. But we thought, gosh, it would be kind of lovely if things lined up as nicely as possible. It doesn't always work, and you'll see certain units and be like, this does not match this instructional segment, but it has to go somewhere, so that's where it went. Sometimes the concepts, you're reading about something in Wonders, and then the next week you're learning about it in Savvas, which is okay because you get that background knowledge. Sometimes Savvas is teaching us something, and then it comes up a little later in Wonders, which again, adding to our background knowledge. I mean, there's a case to be made either way. All right. Here's the layout of Savvas. You have that instructional segment, again with that anchoring phenomenon, California-based phenomenon, and then you have topics. So the term is instructional segment and then topic, and then within each topic you have 2 or 3 lessons, and then you revisit those anchoring phenomenon at the end. So launching the phenomena, revisiting the phenomenon at the end, and then within those 2 areas there's this, what they call the 5E lesson plan. Engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. And when I first heard about these and was like going through, I was like, okay, am I the explorer or am I explaining? Where does this fit, right? And what I learned is that, well, first of all, it makes sense that engage would come at the beginning, right? Obviously. And then evaluate, okay, that makes sense. We do that towards the end, right? But here, this part could be messy. You might, with your students, be exploring something, and then you think you're explaining it, but then you realize you learned something else, and then you got to go back and explore again, right? So don't worry about, I guess the point is, don't worry about which E am I on, where am I, oh gosh, is this the right, when you see, you'll see the 5 E's, you'll see these words all throughout the curriculum. They've done all this for you. It's super helpful, and you don't need to worry, like, which phase am I in? Are we evaluating? Oh God, right? That's just the flow. They'll take you through the flow. But this sort of model should seem familiar, right? Of course, we're gonna, in the warm-up in math, that's kind of where we're engaging students. We're asking them to notice, to wonder, to look. What do you see? What conversations can we have about this phenomenon, right? We might kind of almost think of our warm-ups as a phenomenon. Then we engage in some classroom activities where we're kind of exploring a little bit more. We're having different students explain their thinking, right? Then we go to a synthesis, we kind of wrap it all up, and then the cool down is our evaluation. How do we do? Did our kids get the concept? What other, tweaks do I need to make? Which is sort of like evaluating, right? So similar concepts. Whenever anything kind of crosses over, we're like, yes, this feels familiar. All right. In Savvas, you're going to see pages, and your students will see these pages that say Quest, and these are project-based learning projects for students, and it's kind of this orange and turquoise writing. You'll see them come up. Your students are going to the lab, so they are getting project-based learning there. If you find yourself strapped for time, do not worry about doing these quests. You can absolutely do them if you want to, if you have time. Do not, I wouldn't say we're only doing the quests and we're not reading any of the rest of the text. Like, that would not be the model that was necessarily going to build the knowledge. But they are really fun projects. You can see this one's a couple lessons long. But for this year, we're kind of telling everybody, like, don't worry about quests. To remember it, quest, take a rest. This year, we're going to let the quest take a rest. And as we get more comfortable with teaching science, and if you have time and you're like, gosh, my students really love this, the pictures are great, then yeah, if you do have time, go for it. You might have time. So pages to tab in your TE, again, the 3-dimensional teaching, the questions. I like the year at a glance or the topics at a glance pages that just kind of show me like how this whole thing's laid out. I'm very much like, show me the whole structure, and then I can figure it out from there. And just marking your ISs, so where your instructional segments are. There's 4 of them. Where do they start? Which one's which? That might be helpful as well. So year 1 priority for science is the students are building knowledge by reading and or listening to the text read, right? You can probably read the text aloud to them. They're speaking and writing from the text. Try the labs, emphasize the science and engineering practices through think alouds. And the quests are optional as STEM is being covered in the labs with your specialists using the PLTW curriculum. If you need to know how to access any of the resources I've shared with you, go to the class link, Teaching and Learning Resources, go to the huddle. Welcome to the huddle. If you haven't seen it before, you're going to scroll down to the science, history and science as our content area row there, and you'll see we have pacing for you with wonders. We also have something in there called field notes. So if the pacing is like that's where you're at and you don't need to know anything more about science this year, then just avert your eyes right now. But if you're, hey, I'd like to know, here's my pacing, right? I'd like to know a little bit more about what the framework says on this. I need some clarification. We have all your frameworks. If you want to go a little bit deeper, if you want to go really deep, you can read your standards, right? So KN1, your pacing that I just showed you is here. Framework is here. Standards are here. We also have some different models. If you want to know more about the 5E lesson design, this is not, only in Savvas. It's kind of a, popular model for teaching science. If you want to know more about the 3 dimensions of science or questioning, if you want those sampling weekly schedules that I showed you, they're here. Some great Savvas tools that they've shared with us are located here. I'm sure they'll talk more about them. We also have a couple different, just great science-y institutions. Their websites are linked up here, and if you click on any of these, they will take you directly to the educator page for that. So if I want to show some pictures of giraffes or whatever from the San Diego Zoo, I would click here, and it will take you directly to the teacher educator page, which might give you some, kind of narrow your search a little bit on those websites. So we like this page because it just kind of puts everything in one place for science. But again, if this is too much, there's a lot here. It's like a huddle for science. Then don't worry about it. Just stick with your pacing. That pacing is on the huddle for you, and that's where we live, right? Finally, just a nice quote from our framework. Learning science depends not only on the accumulation of facts and concepts, but also on the development of an identity as a competent learner of science with motivation and interest to learn more. Such identity formation is valuable not only for the small number of students who, over the course of a lifetime, will come to view themselves as scientists or engineers, but also for the great majority of students who do not follow these professional paths. Science learning in school leads to citizens with confidence, ability, and inclination to continue learning about issues, scientific and otherwise, that affect their lives and communities. 2012 from our framework. It's a great quote to launch us into our science. And just finally, thank you. On behalf of Diana, our elementary science TOSA, please email her with any questions you have. We're here to support you. And of course, Teaching Learning TOSAs, we're here too. Anytime you need us. Have a great rest of your training. All right. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.